Family mocked my fiancé's job for years. I finally told them how much he makes. Cousin panicked. Aunt rewrote history. Dad welcomed him like a king. And now my husband is the family's new role model. For years, my family has had plenty to say about my fiancé's job. You really think you'll be happy with a guy who's basically a glorified mechanic? My aunt would smirk over Thanksgiving dinner, sipping her wine like she had just delivered the greatest insult of all time. Hope he knows how to budget, 'cause I don't see a future CEO title in his future, my cousin chimed in once, laughing. The thing is, my fiancé Jake is an aircraft maintenance engineer. And while my family seems to think he's out there scraping oil off engines for minimum wage, the reality is, he makes a lot. Like more than any of them. But we never felt the need to correct them. Jake's humble, and I didn't feel like sharing his salary was anyone's business. That was until last weekend. We were at my parents' house for a family gathering, and as usual, the topic of jobs came up. My uncle started cracking jokes about how I should have found a doctor or lawyer, and my sister, ever the instigator, said, "Well, at least he can fix your car for free." For some reason, that was the breaking point. Maybe it was the years of condescension, the subtle digs, or the fact that Jake just sat there, politely smiling while they talked down about his career. I took a sip of my drink, looked my aunt dead in the eye, and said, "You know, it's funny how you all think Jake's struggling when he actually makes over $150,000 a year. More than all of you, actually." The silence was delicious. My uncle, who had spent half the night boasting about his hard-earned manager position, turned an alarming shade of pink. My cousin, who still lived with his parents while trying to find himself, choked on his drink. My mom blinked rapidly, like her entire worldview had just been shaken. Jake just chuckled and said, "Yeah, aviation pays pretty well." Now my family is acting weird. My aunt is suddenly asking Jake for career advice for her son. My cousin, who was always the first to talk down about blue-collar jobs, is suddenly interested in how to get into the field. My uncle? Oh, he's still salty. But you know what? I don't feel bad at all. After years of taking their jabs, it was satisfying to watch their faces when they realized that the guy they mocked for fixing planes was earning double what they were. So, am I a bad person for finally setting the record straight? 'Cause honestly, I'd do it again in a heartbeat. After dropping that little truth bomb, I expected my family to brush it off, maybe make a joke to save face. But oh no, this was a full-blown reputation crisis. My aunt, the same woman who once said, "A man in a jumpsuit isn't exactly husband material," suddenly turned into Jake's biggest fan. "You know, I always said aviation was a smart career," she gushed at brunch the next morning, her tone as forced as a bad wig. "Planes are so important. Without mechanics, society would just collapse." Jake, bless him, just nodded along, playing it cool. My cousin, who up until now had been convinced he was destined to be a social media entrepreneur, translation unemployed, actually pulled Jake aside and asked, "So, do you think I could get into that? You know, if I wanted to." Mind you, this is the same cousin who once said, "I could never work with my hands, feels too much like labor." But the real MVP of this meltdown? My uncle. This man, who had spent years bragging about his respectable corporate job, middle management at a company that makes office supplies, was seething. "You know," he grumbled, swirling his beer around like he was deep in thought, "money isn't everything. Some of us prioritize stability over big checks." I nearly choked on my drink. Stability? Sir, you've had 3 layoffs in 5 years. Meanwhile, Jake is out here with job security for life because, fun fact, planes always need fixing. The best part? My mom pulled me aside later and actually apologized. "I didn't realize how much we've been dismissive of Jake's career," she admitted, wringing her hands. "We were just worried about you marrying someone who, well, you know, didn't wear a suit." I finished for her. She had the decency to look embarrassed. But here's the thing. If Jake did wear a suit and made half his salary, they wouldn't have said a word. It wasn't about money, it was about status. And once they realized Jake had both, oh, suddenly he was the golden boy. That night, Jake and I drove home and I asked him, "Do you wish I hadn't said anything?" He smirked. "Nah. Watching your uncle short-circuit was worth it." Honestly, same. The next family gathering was hilarious. My uncle, still recovering from his ego being knocked down a few pegs, was suddenly very interested in Jake's job. "So, How does someone even get into aviation maintenance? He asked, in the most forced casual tone I've ever heard. I swear, this man has never cared about anything outside of his own corporate bubble. And now he was practically interviewing Jake. Jake, being the patient man he is, explained the training process, how he went to trade school, got his certifications, and worked his way up. Sounds intense, my uncle muttered, clearly trying to make it seem less impressive. Must be exhausting work. Jake shrugged. It's not bad. I work 4 days a week and still make 6 figures. That was it. That was the fatality. I saw my uncle's spirit leave his body. He had spent years glorifying his 60-hour work weeks, calling it the grind. And here's Jake, casually revealing that he works less than my uncle but makes way more. Meanwhile, my cousin was suspiciously nice to Jake. Like too nice. Hey man, you're so lucky. If I had known aviation was the move, I totally would have done that instead of, marketing. This is the same cousin who 2 years ago told me I was settling by being with Jake. Oh, how the tables have turned. The best part? My aunt miraculously stopped making snide remarks about Jake's job. In fact, she actually bragged about him to her friends. I overheard her on the phone saying, "Oh, my niece's fiancé is in aviation. Such a great career. Really stable. Great benefits. Mom, 2 months ago, you said I needed to reconsider my future. Now Jake's a hot commodity." I didn't call her out. I just sat back and enjoyed the show. The real cherry on top, though? My mom, who had never given Jake much credit before, invited him to golf with my dad and uncle. Let me explain why this is a big deal. The men in my family have treated golf like it's some sacred ritual, reserved only for the most successful members of the household. Jake had never been invited before. So when my mom casually said, "You should join them this weekend," I nearly dropped my fork. Even Jake looked surprised. "Golf's not really my thing," he admitted. "But I appreciate the invite." My uncle looked personally offended. Like, how dare Jake be so successful and not care about their little elitist hobby. My dad, to his credit, just nodded. "Well, if you ever want to try, let me know." That's when I knew Jake wasn't just tolerated now. He was respected. And all it took was one sentence from me. Moral of the story: sometimes, people don't respect you until they're forced to. And sometimes, it's deeply satisfying to be the one to force them. After that golf invite, I thought things would settle down. Maybe my family would just accept that Jake was successful, and we'd move on. Oh, how naive I was. Because once they got over the shock of Jake's salary, my family did what they do best, turned it into a competition. It started subtly. My uncle suddenly became obsessed with investments and strategic financial growth, which was just a fancy way of saying he started humble bragging about his 401k every 5 minutes. Then my cousin, yes, the same cousin who thought having a job was optional, started talking about going back to school for something technical. "I just think the trades are where it's at, he said, nodding sagely, as if he had not, just months ago, made fun of Jake's career. And then came my aunt. Now, if you've been paying attention, my aunt is not one to be left out of a social hierarchy shift. If Jake was the new golden boy, she needed a way to stay on top. So she found a new angle. She said one afternoon, swirling her 3rd glass of wine. "Now that you and Jake are so comfortable, are you two thinking about kids?" Oh, my God. This woman went from mocking my relationship to trying to womb watch in record time. I just smiled and said, "Nah, we're focused on traveling right now." Which was true, but also the perfect way to make her malfunction. My family equates success with milestones: get married, buy a house, have kids. The idea that Jake and I were perfectly content without checking those boxes? Unacceptable. She said, looking directly at my mom. "Grandbabies would be so nice." I saw what she was doing. She was trying to reframe the conversation, to put me back in a position where she had something over me. But my mom, to my surprise, just shrugged. "They'll do it when they're ready." Huh. Growth. But the real twist in this saga? My dad. Now, my dad has always been quietly neutral in family drama. He doesn't stir the pot, doesn't play favorites. He just sits back, drinks his coffee, and lets my mom handle things. So I was shocked when he pulled Jake aside after dinner one night and said, "Hey, you got a minute?" They went into my dad's study, a place usually reserved for serious discussions. My uncle immediately tried to eavesdrop, but my mom shot him a look that made him sit his nosy self back down. When they finally came out, Jake looked amused but didn't say much. Later, when we got in the car, I asked, "So what was that about?" Jake chuckled. "Your dad asked if I wanted to invest in some property with him." "Excuse me, what?" My dad, who has never gone into business with anyone outside of family, wanted to invest with Jake? Did he offer that to my uncle? I asked. Jake smirked. Nope. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about respect anymore. My dad saw value in Jake. He wasn't just in the family now. He was officially a power player. My uncle, upon realizing this, spent the rest of the night sulking into his beer. My cousin, sensing his window of opportunity closing, suddenly became very interested in how to become an aircraft mechanic. And my aunt? Well, she started subtly hinting that Jake should help her son find a job in aviation. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. And Jake? He just kept sipping his drink, letting them all squirm. I've never loved this man more. At this point, Jake was no longer just my fiancé. He was an urban legend in my family. My uncle was in denial, my cousin was plotting his aviation career comeback, and my aunt was conveniently rewriting history to make it seem like she had always believed in Jake's potential. But the true peak of this saga? The family Christmas party. Every year my parents host this big Christmas Eve gathering, tons of food, extended family, gift exchanges, the whole deal. This year, though, the vibe was different. For the first time ever, Jake wasn't just a guest. He was the main event. People who had barely acknowledged him in past years were suddenly all smiles. My great-aunt, who had once clutched her pearls at the thought of me marrying a manual laborer, greeted Jake with, "Oh, sweetheart, you look so handsome. And so successful." It was like watching politicians switch sides after an election. And then came the moment. My uncle, desperate to reclaim some authority, suggested we play a friendly game of white elephant with a $50 limit. Jake, playing along, brought a wrapped box and tossed it into the pile. Now here's what you need to understand. My family takes white elephant seriously. It's a blood sport. My cousin once nearly fought a teenager over a limited edition bottle of whiskey. So when Jake's gift was unwrapped, everything changed. It was an envelope. Inside, a first-class airline voucher. Not a discount. Not a gift card. A fully paid-for first-class ticket to anywhere domestic. The room went silent. "Wait," my aunt squawked. "This isn't real, right?" Jake just smiled. "No, it's legit." My cousin nearly leaped across the table to steal it. My uncle, livid at the attention Jake was getting, tried to downplay it. "I mean," he scoffed, "must be nice to just throw money around like that." And that's when Jake, the legend, delivered his final blow. "Oh, it didn't cost me anything," he said, shrugging. "I fly so much for work, I rack up points like crazy. Thought I'd put them to good use." My uncle's soul left his body. Not only was Jake wealthy, he was smart with money. Meanwhile, my cousin, who had spent years dismissing Jake's job, was now Googling aviation programs under the table. But the cherry on top? After the party, my dad pulled Jake aside again. "I like how you handled yourself tonight," he said. "You ever think about expanding beyond aviation?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "Why?" My dad just smiled. "Because I think you're a man who knows how to play the long game. And that, my friends, is how my fiancé went from the family joke to the family favorite." Moral of the story? Underestimate the quiet ones at your own risk. By the time New Year's rolled around, Jake had gone from background character to main protagonist in my family's narrative. My uncle was still licking his wounds, my cousin was in full-blown career crisis mode, and my aunt? Oh, she had moved into full revisionist history. "I always said Jake was a smart guy," she cooed at brunch one day, sipping her bottomless mimosa like she hadn't spent years calling him a glorified handyman. "You're so lucky, sweetie." Oh, I know. But the real final boss battle came in February, when Jake and I announced our wedding date. Now, I knew my family would turn this into a competition because, of course, they would. My uncle and aunt started subtly poking around about the venue, trying to figure out just how nice this wedding was about to be. "So, where are you guys thinking?" my uncle asked casually, like he wasn't dying to gauge the level of extravagance. "Oh, we already booked it," I said, smirking. My cousin perked up. Where? Jake, who had been enjoying this entire saga in silence, finally spoke. Hawaii. Boom. My aunt dropped her mimosa. My uncle sputtered. My cousin looked like he had just witnessed a life-altering event. Hawaii? My aunt gasped, as if I had just told her we were getting married on Mars. Yep, I said, taking a casual sip of my coffee. Private beachfront venue, all-inclusive package. It's gonna be gorgeous. But my uncle struggled to find words. That must have been expensive. Jake just shrugged. Well, we had the money. And the airline miles. I thought that would be the end of it, but oh no. My uncle could not let it go. He immediately turned to my dad. You're okay with this? My dad, who had been quietly watching this entire saga unfold, just nodded. They're smart, he said simply. They know what they're doing. And that was the moment I knew. This wasn't just about Jake anymore. This was about me. For years, my family had treated me like I needed saving, like I had made a mistake by choosing Jake. But now they were realizing that I hadn't just won in love. I had won at life. I had chosen a partner who was successful, humble, and completely unbothered by their nonsense. And that burned them more than anything. And the final twist? A week later, my cousin, who had once laughed at Jake's job, sent me a text. Hey, do you think Jake would help me figure out how to get into aviation? I nearly died laughing. Sorry, buddy. The networking window closed the second you called my fiancé a mechanic. As the reception carried on, I watched my family interact with Jake in a way I never thought possible. My uncle, the man who once laughed at the idea of me marrying a mechanic, was now actively seeking Jake out for conversation, asking questions about career stability and work-life balance. My cousin, who had previously mocked the idea of any job that required actual effort, was practically glued to Jake's side, nodding along like an eager intern during their chat about the aviation industry. At one point I overheard him casually ask, So, you think someone like me could get into that field? And my aunt? Oh, she had fully rewritten history by now. During dinner I caught her telling one of my relatives, I always knew Jake was going to be successful. He just has that energy, so grounded, so intelligent. I nearly choked on my champagne. But my favorite moment? About an hour after my dad's speech, my uncle finally approached Jake, drink in hand, and pulled him aside. Now, keep in mind, my uncle is not the type to admit defeat. Ever. If you told this man the sky was blue, he'd argue about the reflection of light just to be difficult. So when I saw him lean in and mutter something to Jake, I casually inched closer. And that's when I heard it. Kid, he said, swirling his drink around. I might have misjudged you. Jake, as cool as ever, just nodded. Yeah. My uncle sighed, clearly pained by the words coming out of his own mouth. You're a smart guy. I respect that. That was it. That was his version of waving the white flag. And Jake? He just smiled, clinked his glass against my uncle's, and said, Took you long enough. I nearly fell out of my chair. At this point, my cousin and aunt were practically lining up to get career advice from Jake. My mom, who had once worried about whether I was making the right choice, was now looking at him like he hung the damn moon. And my dad? My stoic, no-nonsense dad? He put a hand on Jake's shoulder at the end of the night and said, Welcome to the family, son. Jake just grinned. Took you long enough to. I don't know how I ended up marrying a man who wins long games so effortlessly, but damn if I'm not glad I did. That night, as we walked back to our suite, hand in hand, I nudged him and whispered, So you completely demolished my uncle's ego in under a year. How does it feel? Jake smirked, his eyes twinkling. Honestly, pretty satisfying. And with that, we stepped into our future together, me, my legendary husband, and the humbled remains of my family's ego. Best wing ever.